Croeso, Difda, Bernachtin, Gia Hwitch, Fulcher, Daymat. Welcome to the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. I am your humble host, Sian Esther Powell, and I'm going to be taking you on a journey through all the myths and legends of the 6 Celtic nations. That's Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, Isle of Man, Scotland and Ireland. Welcome. Welcome. That's going to be my new tradition now, is just adding on an extra welcome like that. If you know, you know. So some of you will know that we should be back to Brittany today. We are, by the way, I don't know why I say should. We are back to Brittany. Each one of my episodes, I focus on one of the 6 Celtic nations, and we always do it in the same order. And when I get back to Brittany, I usually go back to Cornwall. But I'm going to be doing things a little bit differently from 2024 onward. We are going to be adding 2 new regions, Galicia and Asturias. I don't know how long that will last, because they are quite close together, whether or not I can do an episode for both, but I also want to recognise the autonomy of both and the identity of both. I'm still not hugely well versed in Galicia and Asturias, so I'm really looking forward to delving more into the folklore, the history, the culture, the old languages of these regions. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning a lot more there. So 2024 is going to be really exciting. I've already got my spreadsheet for the whole year planned. I've got all my topics planned. I would really like to welcome in a few guests next year and keep evolving the show in the best way that I can. So for this episode, as I said, I'm back to Brittany, and I am almost shocked that I have not covered this yet, because it's one of those things that when I think of Breton folklore, I think of this creature. So I cannot tell you why I haven't covered it yet. Maybe I wanted to be different and cover things that weren't quite well as known, known as well. Oh my goodness, known as well was known. Keep going, Sian, keep going. We'll find our way through. But I have a friend that has been requesting me to cover the Korrigans of Breton folklore for years. I don't know why I never did it before, but we're going to finally do it now. So what are the Breton Korrigans? Otherwise known as correds, these are very mischievous, cheeky chappies, quite similar in fact to the Cornish piskie. And yet they might also take the shape of a beautiful siren, luring men to their deaths. And even if you were to refuse a corrigan's favour, you might still have a doomed fate. Korrigans have been described as dwarf-like creatures. Korrigans have been described as fairies 2 feet tall with wings. Korrigans have been described as mermaid siren-like creatures. Korrigans have been described as beautiful, as ugly, as mischievous, as dangerous, as being able to tell your fortune, being willing to steal all your possessions, conjurers of great enchantments, haters of the Christian religion. Wait a minute, hang on. What are they? What actually are Korrigans? Because I can't seem to find a definitive answer. See, when I started this, I thought Korrigans were the mischievous Cornish piskie-like creatures, dwarf-like, masculine in appearance, very capricious. But now I'm not all that sure. And this is the wonder, but also the frustration of folklore. So let's start again. What are the Breton Korrigans? Maybe they're both of those things, right? They are the beautiful, golden-haired, laughing sirens who tempt poor Christian men, but also maybe they are these mischievous dwarf-like creatures who hide around stone circles and dolmens. And this really comes back to my point that I've made many times before, in that there is no one correct version of a story. All storytellers have their own interests, agendas, if you want to say that word, their own kind of unique spin and angle on various stories. And the really interesting thing with folklore is that so many of these stories never existed on paper. They were oral stories that you tell your grandchildren. They weren't these stories that were written down in books like they are today. So all of the folklorists that collected these stories, mostly 100, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, when they collected these stories, they were only collecting the versions that they heard at the time, and probably emphasizing some elements and, putting their own spin on some other stories, depending on, again, what was interesting to them, what kind of messages they could glean from the story and that kind of thing, what observations they could make on the community that were sharing these stories. But you have to understand that there's probably infinite versions of some of these stories depending on what family was telling them. So it just happens that they heard one version. So there is no one definitive version of any folktale ever. There is no correct version for a story. We tell stories in a number of different ways. Obviously, you can be an academic that studies folklore, and you can use folklore as a really interesting tool to understand human beings and that kind of thing. But there is no kind of like one academic true version of a folktale. There's always going to be multiple versions of a story. And another interesting thing about folklore is that it's an odd, difficult thing to discuss at times, because you are relying on the stories that have been collected by past folklorists who are speaking to a very small sample size of the community which this folktale belonged to. And then it's this whole idea of folktales even belonging to a place, and that's the basis of my whole podcast, isn't it? The Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. Oh my goodness, we're getting deep here, guys. We're getting deep. I'm about to argue myself out of a podcast. But it's why, for me, stories, I love these stories, and I always emphasize that Celtic is an umbrella term, and all of these stories are just, coming under that very messy, broad umbrella term. But these stories are for everyone. All of these stories that I mention, they are for everyone. If you are listening to this podcast and you have absolutely nothing to do with any of the Celtic nations, that doesn't matter. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm delighted that you're here listening to this show. Thank you so much. You are more than welcome. I'm proud of Cornish stories. I'm proud of the wealth of folklore and mythology and legends that has come from this small region where I'm from. And, it is part of the important tapestry that makes up minority Cornish culture. But stories are for everyone. Stories should be for everyone. And so I'm always very kind of, I guess, for want of a better term, really, inclusive and open-minded with this podcast, because it's for everyone. I'm not making this podcast for a tiny minority of people. I'm making it for anyone that loves stories, for anyone that wants to learn about the kind of these magical creatures that we've come up with, or I don't know, maybe do exist in the world. It's a pretty big world. Who knows about all of the answers and whatever, the fabric of the universe. I don't know. I haven't got the foggiest. But all of that to say, these stories belong to everyone, but it does make it sometimes a bit difficult to find the right sources to talk about creature and to give you the right amount of information that you've got a general idea of what it was, which is what I'm trying to do with this show. Sometimes I cover like creature features, like this sort of thing, but sometimes I'm covering medieval literature, so we do have an actual source for it. We do have the one version, but usually those written sources are again working on past oral versions as well. So I just wanted to go on a little rant there. Oh, no, me talking in tangents. Never ever. I wanted to go on a little tangent there just to talk about how interesting folklore is in general, because it is difficult to kind of quantify. It is difficult to find the right information sometimes. And when it comes to Breton folklore, it's even more difficult for me because a lot of the texts are written in French. And I'm not a French speaker or French reader, so sometimes finding the right information can be a little bit difficult. So I wanted to just hold my hands up and say, look, for the Korrigans, there's all this conflicting stuff. There's some people that say that they are these beautiful sirens, some people that say that they are these horrifying little mischievous pisky-like creatures. So let's just get into all of it. I'm not going to say one's right, one's wrong. I'm just going to give you all of it, and you can just come up with your own idea on what the Korrigan is, other than Mark from Peep Show. Hilarious reference, Sean. Well done, slipping that in there seamlessly, fluidly. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast episode, sorry, it feels a little bit weird because I actually recorded all of that previous to going up to Wales for Christmas, and now it's the other end of that, and my brain's been doing some interesting weird things the last few days. So anyway, we move. So if you hear a bit of a tonal shift, that's the reason. But when I initially thought about Korrigans, I think I was very much thinking about my friend who seems to really, really love them. It's one of their favourite creatures, and they've been requesting it for a long time. And I thought of the Dungeons and Dragons type of Korred. So I think Korred is a creature found in Dungeons and Dragons and found in fantasy, a sort of mischievous dwarf-like creature. And I did find it in one book called, and my friend actually gave me this book, so called A Field Guide to the Little People by Nancy Arrowsmith and George Morse. It's an interesting book. Some of their entries are a little bit iffy, but then again, there is no one version of a folktale. I just made that very clear in the previous 10 minutes, so I'm not gonna poo-poo it too much. It is a fun book, and it's done in the style of a field guide. So I'd actually love to do my own version of something like this for Cornish piskies in general, the Pobl the little folk of Cornwall. So when I initially thought of Korrigan, I thought of that kind of pisky-like dwarf character that's very mischievous, very wait for it, guys, very, you know what I'm gonna say, very capricious. Very capricious. If I was ever going to have podcast merch, it would probably be The Fairies Are Capricious. And the Korreds are no exception. As I've mentioned, they're very similar to Cornish piskies, and in fact, Korreds are described as often being found near dolmens, which are very much found in Cornwall and Brittany. A dolmen is the two large standing slabs with one slab of granite or rock on top of it. Dolmens in Cornish and Breton folklore are very much seen as sort of portals to perhaps another world, or, you know, an afterlife or something like that. They're seen as a liminal space in the same way as you get burial mounds in Irish folklore being a portal to the other world. In some stories, the Korreds or Korrigans are described as being so strong that they carried these massive slabs of granite on their back, and it is they that put the dolmen in its place. Much like the Cornish piskie, they are fond of dancing in their own merry ways, and not very happy when humans seem to come upon them, and especially if humans were to try and join in with the dance. Small wizened creatures, 1 to 3 feet tall, living deep in the forests or in sea caverns along the coast, and not particularly friendly. In Lewis Spencer's 1917 Legends and Romances of Brittany, he describes how the peasant folk of Brittany believed that the dolmens were in fact built by fairies or spirits. He writes, "For the most part then, the megaliths, in the opinion of the Breton peasant, are not the handiwork of man. He would rather refer their origin to spirits, giants, or fiends. If he makes any exception to this supernatural attribution, it is in favour of the saints he reverences so profoundly. The fairies, he says, harnessed their oxen to the mighty stones, selected a site, and dragged them thither to form a dwelling, or perhaps a cradle for the infant phase they were so fond of exchanging for human children. He describes one such monument as Tien Corrigant, the house of the Korrigans, and that is the single lone source for that name that I can find anywhere. And this isn't too surprising, considering that a lot of folklorists were, they were talking to people, they were collecting their stories, and so they were probably getting some local names for some places that weren't ever officially recorded. A sound was Bailey jumping on my bed then, just what you'd want to know. So that was the dwarven corrigan, the pisky-like creature that built the dolmens of Brittany. And you may also find reference to this in The Magic Rocks and the Beggar, a folktale collected by Elsie Masson in 1929 as part of the Folk Tales of Brittany collection. She writes, "But if the folk there have neither corn nor cattle, they have more stones than you would need to build a town. For just outside the village there is a big stretch of heather where long ago the Korrigans, a race of elves who lived in ancient Brittany, planted 2 rows of tall rocks which look for all the world like an avenue, except that they lead nowhere." And in her folktale, Yannick, the fairy child, she writes, "Long, long ago, when within the rocky shores of Finisterre there were few houses or villages, and even fewer cultivated pastures. In those days wild reaches of marsh and woodland were haunted by the will-o'-the-wisp, bears and savage wolves. Then elves danced on the lonely heaths, and men had strange visions." But what of the other corrigan? What of the stories of the distrustful sirens, wary of the Christian religion? In the 1870 fairy mythology by Thomas Keatley, he includes a poem, Lord Nan and the Corrigan. "The Lord Nan and his bride so fair, in early youth united were, in early youth divided were. The lady lay in yesternight, of twins their skin as snow was white, a boy and girl that glad his sight. What doth thy heart desire, loved one, for giving me so fair a son? Say, and at once it shall be done." A woodcock from the pool of the glen, roebuck from the forest green. The roebuck's flesh is savoury, but for it thou to the wood shouldst he. Lord Nan, when he these words did hear, he forthwith grasped his oaken spear, and vaulting on his coal-black steed unto the greenwood heed with speed. When he unto the wood drew nigh, a fair white doe he there did spy, and after her such chase he made, the ground it shook beneath their tread, and after her such chase made he, from his brows the water copiously, and from his horse's side ran down, the evening had now come on, and he came where a streamlet flowed, fast by a corrigan's abode, and grassy turf spread all around, to quench his thirst he sprang to ground. The corrig at her fount sat there, a combing of her long fair hair. She combed it with a comb of gold. These ladies ne'er are poor, we're told. "Rash man," cried she, "how dost thou dare to come disturb my waters fair? Thou shalt untie me, plight thy fay, or 7 years thou shalt waste away, or thou shalt die ere the 3rd day. To thee my faith plight will I ne'er, for I am married now a year. I shall not surely waste away, nor shall I die ere the 3rd day. I shall not die within 3 days, but when it unto God shall please. Good mother mine, if you love me, see that thy bed made ready be, for I have ta'en a malady. Let not one word to my wife be told, in 3 days I shall lie in the mould, a corrigan has thus foretold. And when 3 days were past and gone, the young wife asked this question: My mother-in-law, now tell me why the bells all ring thus constantly, and why the priests a low mass sing, all clad in white as the bells ring. Last night a poor man died whom we a lodging gave through clarity. My mother-in-law, tell me, I pray, my Lord Nan, whither he gone away? My daughter to the town here gone, to see thee he will come anon. Good mother-in-law, to church to fare, shall I red or blue gown wear? The custom now is daughter dear, at church always in black to appear. As they crossed o'er the churchyard wall, on her husband's grave her eye did fall. Who is now dead of our family, that thus fresh dug our grave I see? Alas, my child, and the truth can I not hide, thy husband there doth lie. On her 2 knees herself she cast, and rose no more, she breathed her last. It was a marvel to see, men say, the night that followed the day, the lady in earth by her lord lay. To see 2 oak trees themselves rear, from the new-made graves into the air, and on their branches 2 doves white, who were there hopping gay and light, which sang when rose the morning ray, and then toward heaven sped away. In this example, we have a corrigan as a sort of mermaid siren type of creature who lures men and can also cast curses upon them. And it was actually this poem which inspired J.R.R. Tolkien to write his poem The Lay of Atru and Itrun in 1930. Which tells the story of a couple in Breton nobility who are blessed with a child from a witch who that later reveals herself to be a corrigan and asks for his love. And when he refuses, he's a happily married man, then he dies in 3 days. And his wife follows him, dying of a broken heart. This is interesting because there is a very similar creature in the Melusine, which is a kind of mermaid or siren-like creature with a feminine upper half, and the lower half is usually that of a fish or a snake. And some of you might also remember that Daiut, the ill-fated princess in the fall of the city of Ys, also gets turned into a Mary Morgan, another mermaid type of creature. So it would seem that there are lots of different names for Breton creatures that are kind of like pisky or dwarf-like spirits, but also lots of names for mermaid type creatures as well. And usually all of them are kind of negative in connotation. They're all quite sinister, which seems to be a great theme for the Breton folklore. It's all pretty creepy and sinister and quite gothic. So what's your favourite corrigan? The creepy dancing dwarf pisky, or the sinister mermaid siren type of creature? It seems from reading, and I'm going to just confuse myself more the further down I go into the rabbit hole, that corrigan, or any sort of form of corrigan, corrig, correc, corred, they could all be ways to describe perhaps fairy or pisky or dwarf or spirit. So it seems that there's a lot of variety within that term, so it seems like it could perhaps be an umbrella term more than one very specific folkloric creature. But I hope that gave you an interesting taste of, some poems, some folk tales, some analysis, some interesting points on folklore and kind of the difficulty sometimes in pinpointing down what the actual name for a folkloric creature is, or whether there is one name, or what the correct version of a story is, or in fact, is there a correct version? No is usually the answer. This episode has taken me ages to record because I did the first chunk of it about a couple of weeks ago, and then I've tried to do sort of bits of it here and there, so hopefully it's all come together as a sort of cohesive unit thing, and I hope that you enjoyed it. I'm not going to be charging my patrons on Patreon for this episode. It's the last one of the year, and I know how tight purse strings are at this time of year, so I don't know how it works for where you guys are, but where I am, we get paid a little bit before Christmas, which is really nice, but then it does mean that for the rest of December and the whole of January that things are pretty tight, so I won't charge patrons for this. But if you are interested in supporting this podcast, and you would be very, very welcome to do so, please find the Patreon. I am very, very, very slowly but surely working my way through. I've got a spreadsheet now, working my way through all of the mini episodes that I am due people who are on the higher tier. But other than that, you know, all of these episodes that I put out are free. I don't expect anyone to support me in a monetary way. It's very, very appreciated when you do, but it's not a necessity. But I do want to say a big thank you to my two new patrons, Call Me Snowball and Willem Callens. Thank you ever so much. It is really, really, really appreciated. Thank you all for listening. I hope that you had a lovely Christmas, and if you didn't, then I hope that you have a great New Year, and if you don't, then I hope that 2024 brings us all a bit of strength, a bit of resilience, a bit of grace, and lots of joy. Thank you very much, and speak to you again in the new year. Bye. I am your host, Sian Esther Powell, and that has been another episode of the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. If you would like to find it elsewhere on the interwebs, you can also find me on Twitter at Celtic Myths Pod, on Facebook under Celtic Myths and Legends Podcast, on Patreon at Celtic Myths Pod, as well as Instagram at Celtic_Sian, and also CelticSian.co.uk. Thank you, Muraz, Diolch, Tachpalet, Guramahagat, Trugare, Guramayed. Thank you, and speak to you next time. Thank you.